Harlem, New York, Friday night, June 14th, 1935. The Red Rooster Club on 138th Street and Lenox Avenue, approximately 11:47 p.m. The air inside is thick. Cigar smoke layered over perfume, sweat mixing with bootleg gin fumes that management doesn't bother hiding anymore since Prohibition ended 2 years back. The band is working through the second set, trumpet and clarinet weaving lines that make the whole room pulse. 300 people packed into a space built for 200. Bodies pressed against the bar, couples dancing in gaps between tables, money moving, dollar bills for drinks, fives for the poker game in the back room, tens changing hands for other arrangements the police pretend not to notice as long as the envelopes keep arriving on schedule. The club is co-owned by Vincent Maloney, 41, Irish, who runs similar establishments in the Bronx and Brooklyn, and James Sweet Jimmy Patterson, 36, black, who handles the Harlem operations and community relationships that Maloney can't navigate alone. It's a profitable arrangement. The club nets about $3,000 weekly, $1,200 from liquor, $900 from the gambling room, $600 from the door and tips, plus whatever the girls working the upstairs rooms contribute. Half goes to Maloney's family business. Half stays in Harlem with Patterson, managing the neighborhood relationships that keep things running smooth. At 11:47 p.m., a white man in his late 30s walks through the front entrance like he owns the building. His name is Frank Castellano, and he actually does own buildings. 3 tenements in the Bronx, a shipping warehouse near the docks, and part interest in 2 Italian restaurants in Midtown. He's visiting from Philadelphia, in town for a real estate deal brought to the Red Rooster by a business associate who thought Castellano would enjoy Harlem's nightlife. What his associate didn't know was that Castellano carries very specific ideas about black people, about who belongs where, about what he's entitled to say and do, regardless of whose neighborhood he's standing in. Castellano arrives with 2 companions. They take a table near the stage, order bottles of Canadian whiskey that Patterson personally brings over because big spenders get personal service. For 30 minutes, everything proceeds normally. The band plays, Castellano drinks. His companions laugh at his jokes. The room continues its rhythm. Music, conversation, clinking glass, shuffling cards from the back room. Then the band takes a break. The band leader steps to the microphone to announce they'll return in 15 minutes. As the music stops, Castellano stands up. He's drunk, not falling down drunk, but loud drunk, the kind where volume becomes judgment and inhibitions disappear. He walks toward the stage, waving money, saying something about buying the band around, about how they play good for their kind. The band leader, a man named Curtis Washington, who's played trumpet in Harlem clubs for 11 years, tries to deflect politely. Thanks, but they're good. Appreciate it. Going to take our break now. But Castellano doesn't leave. He grabs the microphone, and he says loudly enough that the entire club can hear through the speakers Patterson installed last month. I'll say it again so everyone in here understands. He uses the slur, the full word. Then he adds that the band plays well for people like them, that Harlem has good entertainment even if the neighborhood is filled with a certain kind of element, that a white man can't even enjoy decent music anymore without being surrounded by people who should be grateful anyone bothers to come uptown and spend money in their establishments. The room goes silent. Not the kind of silence where people stop talking gradually. The kind where 300 people stop breathing simultaneously because something impossible just happened. Someone just said the unsayable into a microphone in a black-owned club in the heart of Harlem, and everyone is waiting to see what comes next. Patterson is behind the bar when it happens. According to multiple witnesses who spoke about that night in later years, Patterson's face shows nothing. No anger, no shock, just a careful blankness that people who know him recognize as dangerous. He walks calmly across the floor toward the stage. He gently takes the microphone from Castellano's hand. He speaks quietly, too quietly for anyone except Castellano and the bandleader to hear clearly. But witnesses close enough report that he says something like, "You should leave now, while you still can." While this is just words, Castellano laughs. He says he'll leave when he's ready. He says Patterson should be thanking him for patronizing this establishment. He says if Patterson has a problem with honest observations about the neighborhood, maybe Patterson shouldn't be running a club in the first place. Then he sits back down at his table, orders another bottle, and acts like nothing happened. Patterson returns to the bar. The band starts playing again. The room slowly resumes its rhythm, but the atmosphere has changed. Something broke that can't be unbroken. Everyone who was there understands that a line got crossed, and that lines crossed in Harlem carry consequences, even if those consequences aren't immediately visible. Before we get into what happened in the 7 days after Castellano repeated his insult into that microphone, hit subscribe if you want more stories about moments when disrespect met precision. Drop a comment if you think you know how this ends. What Castellano didn't know, what his Philadelphia ignorance couldn't measure, was that the microphone he grabbed wasn't just amplifying his voice to the room. It was broadcasting his contempt into a network, an invisible structure of relationships, obligations, debts, and long memories that had been building in Harlem for 2 decades. And that network was about to teach him an expensive lesson about the difference between power and permission. Chapter 2. The Architecture Underneath. To understand what happened to Frank Castellano between Friday, June 14 and Friday, June 21st, 1935, you need to understand what Harlem actually was in mid-B 1935. Not the nightlife tourist version that white visitors saw, but the economic and social machinery underneath. By 1935, Harlem had been transforming for nearly 20 years from a predominantly white neighborhood into the center of black cultural and economic life in New York. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of black Americans north from the South, seeking work in factories and freedom from Jim Crow violence. Harlem's population was approximately 200,000 people, roughly 75% black, living in a neighborhood about 2 square miles. That density created markets, and markets created money, and money created power. But only if that money could be organized and protected. The legitimate economy ran through churches, newspapers, small businesses, professional offices. The illegal economy ran through numbers games. Speakeasies turned nightclubs after Prohibition ended. Protection rackets, loan operations, and the complex arrangements between those who wanted to operate businesses and those who could ensure those businesses weren't raided, robbed, or shut down by authorities who could be paid to look elsewhere. This economy wasn't controlled by one person. It was a network of overlapping interests and mutual dependencies. The numbers operators needed protection from police raids and from rivals trying to muscle into their territory. The club owners needed liquor suppliers and security, and relationships with the police precincts that decided which establishments got raided and which got ignored. The landlords who owned Harlem's tenement buildings needed enforcement when tenants couldn't pay rent. The loan sharks needed collectors who could be persuasive without creating the kind of violence that drew newspaper attention. And threading through all of this was Stephanie St. Clair, the woman who, by 1935, had built the most sophisticated numbers operation in Harlem, and who had relationships with virtually every significant figure in the neighborhood's underground economy. St. Clair, known as Queenie or Madame St. Clair, was approximately 36 years old in June 1935, though exact records are unreliable. She'd been running numbers in Harlem since the early 1920s, building an operation that by 1935 employed dozens of runners collecting bets across the neighborhood and generated estimated weekly revenues between $10,000 and $15,000. Her success came from two innovations. She paid out winnings reliably, building trust with bettors who'd been cheated by less honest operators, and she developed relationships with police, politicians, and community leaders that gave her operations protection and legitimacy that rivals couldn't match. By 1935, St. Clair also had an enforcer who'd become essential to her operation's stability. His name was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, approximately 30 years old that June, who'd been working with St. Clair for about 3 years after arriving in Harlem from South Carolina in the early 1930s. Johnson's role was straightforward. He handled problems that required physical presence, intimidation, or violence. When someone tried to rob one of St. Clair's numbers runners, Johnson made sure it didn't happen twice. When a competitor tried to undercut St. Barrett, Clair's operation by setting up rival numbers games in her territory, Johnson persuaded them to operate elsewhere. When landlords needed rent collected from tenants who'd been avoiding payment, Johnson collected it. Johnson was intelligent, disciplined, and careful about avoiding unnecessary violence that would draw police attention St. Clair couldn't deflect. He understood that his job wasn't to hurt people for the sake of hurting them. It was to maintain the economic architecture that made St. Clair's operation profitable. And by June 1935, that architecture included relationships with dozens of Harlem businesses that depended on St. Clair's network for various forms of assistance and protection. The Red Rooster Club was one of those businesses. Sweet Jimmy Patterson had been paying St. Clair approximately $150 weekly since 1933 for what was essentially insurance. Insurance against robberies, insurance against rival operators trying to muscle into his gambling room, insurance against police raids that would shut him down. Patterson's white business partner, Vincent Maloney, considered this a cost of operating in Harlem, the same way he paid protection to Irish and Italian operators in the Bronx and Brooklyn. It was business, but what Maloney didn't fully understand, and what Frank Castellano had no way of knowing when he grabbed that microphone on June 14th, was that the $150 weekly wasn't just buying Patterson protection from thieves and police. It was buying him membership in a network that included the band playing at his club, the liquor suppliers delivering to his back door, the police sergeants who ignored the gambling room, the landlord who owned his building, the laundry service that cleaned his linens, the food suppliers who delivered to his kitchen, the newspaper that advertised his weekend shows. When Patterson called St. Clair on Saturday morning, June 15, to explain what had happened the previous night, he wasn't just reporting an incident. He was invoking the network. And when St. Clair decided that Frank Castellano needed to understand what it meant to publicly insult not just 300 people in a club, but the entire architecture of relationships those people represented, she wasn't acting out of anger. She was enforcing the rules, the unwritten rules that made it possible for black-owned businesses to operate in a city where banks wouldn't loan to them, where landlords charged them higher rents than white tenants, where police could shut them down on any pretext, where white competitors could undercut them with impunity. The rules were simple. Respect the neighborhood, respect the people, and understand that disrespect carries costs. Castellano violated all three. Now he was going to learn what those costs looked like when calculated across a network he'd never suspected existed. Chapter 3. The Sunday Phone Calls. Sunday, June 16, 1935. Stephanie St. Clair spent most of the day making phone calls from her apartment on 140th Street. She didn't move quickly. There was no emergency requiring immediate action. Castellano had already left Harlem Friday night, driven back to his hotel in Midtown, completely unaware that anything consequential had occurred. He'd insulted some people in a nightclub, offended some sensibilities in a neighborhood he didn't respect anyway, and moved on with his weekend. By Sunday morning, he'd probably forgotten the entire incident. But St. Clair hadn't forgotten, and neither had the 300 people who'd been in the Red Rooster Club Friday night, many of whom spent Saturday telling friends and family about the white man who'd used a racial slur into a microphone in Patterson's club, who'd insulted the band and the audience and Harlem itself, who'd acted like he was entitled to say anything he wanted without consequences because he had money and pale skin and Philadelphia addresses. The story spread naturally. Barbershops, church services, Sunday dinners, street corners. By Sunday afternoon, everyone in Harlem's business community knew what had happened. They knew because information moved fast in a neighborhood where survival often depended on knowing who could be trusted and who represented threats. And they knew that if St. Clair was involved, consequences were coming. The only question was what form those consequences would take. St. Clair's first call Sunday morning was to Bumpy Johnson. The conversation was brief. According to accounts Johnson shared years later, But Clair explained what happened at the Red Rooster, asked if Johnson knew anything about Frank Castellano, and requested that Johnson find out who Castellano was, what he owned, who he did business with, and what vulnerabilities might exist in his operations. Johnson spent Sunday afternoon making his own calls and visiting contacts who knew New York's real estate and business networks. By Sunday evening, he'd assembled a basic profile. Frank Castellano owned 3 tenement buildings in the Bronx with approximately 150 total tenants, a warehouse near the Brooklyn docks that he rented to a shipping company, and partial ownership in 2 Italian restaurants in Midtown. His net worth was estimated around $200,000. Substantial, but not extraordinary. He owed money to 2 banks for property mortgages. He had business relationships with Italian and Irish operators in the Bronx. He'd been arrested once in 1928 for assault, but the charges were dropped. He had a wife and 3 children living in a Philadelphia suburb. More importantly, Johnson learned that Castellano's Bronx properties depended on stable relationships with suppliers, tradesmen, and service providers, the same kinds of relationships that made any property operation function. Plumbers, electricians, trash collections, coal delivery for heating, maintenance contractors. These were the invisible threads that kept tenement buildings habitable and profitable. And many of these threads ran through networks that overlapped with Harlem's economy. Networks where St. Clair's influence extended beyond the neighborhood's geographic boundaries. St. Clair's second set of calls Sunday evening went to people who could affect those threads. She called a coal supplier who delivered to buildings throughout Harlem, the Bronx, and parts of Brooklyn. The supplier owed St. Clair favors. She'd loaned him money 2 years earlier when he faced bankruptcy, money he'd repaid, but favors he still owed. She explained that Frank Castellano had caused problems in Harlem and that any assistance the supplier might provide would be remembered. The supplier understood. Coal deliveries to Castellano's buildings would experience delays. Nothing dramatic, just slower service, missed delivery windows, technical problems with scheduling. She called a plumbing contractor who worked on buildings across multiple boroughs. Same conversation. Repairs at Castellano's properties would take longer to schedule, would encounter unexpected complications, would require more visits to complete. She called the owner of a trash collection company that serviced the Bronx. Collections at Castellano's buildings would become irregular. Trash would pile up. Tenants would complain. City inspectors would notice. She called a contact at one of the banks holding Castellano's mortgages. Not a loan officer, but someone in operations who owed St. Clair consideration for past assistance. She didn't ask for anything illegal. just suggested that perhaps Castellano's payment history and property conditions should be reviewed more carefully than usual, that perhaps someone should visit his properties and assess whether they met the standards the bank expected from borrowers. She called the owner of a linen service that supplied restaurants throughout Manhattan, including one of Castellano's midtown establishments. Service would continue, but deliveries might be delayed, quality might slip slightly, nothing actionable but enough to create friction with restaurant customers who expected clean tablecloths and napkins. She called a liquor distributor who supplied both the Red Rooster and various restaurants and clubs across the city. Deliveries to Castellano's restaurants would face similar delays and quality issues. Each conversation was brief, polite, and careful. St. Clair never threatened anyone, never demanded illegal actions, never suggested anything that would obviously connect back to her. She simply explained that Frank Castellano had disrespected Harlem's community, that various business relationships with Castellano might become inconvenient for everyone involved, and that any natural business difficulties Castellano might experience would be understood as the ordinary friction of operating properties and businesses in New York City. By Sunday night, St. Clair had made approximately 20 calls. She'd spent maybe 90 minutes total on the phone. She hadn't broken any laws. She hadn't ordered violence. She hadn't done anything that a prosecutor could build a case around. She'd just activated the network, the invisible architecture of relationships, obligations, and mutual dependencies that made Harlem's economy function, and that extended well beyond Harlem's borders into the broader city's commercial ecosystem. Then she waited, because the thing about networks is they don't move all at once. They ripple, and ripples take time to build into waves that become visible to the people standing on shore convinced the water's calm. Chapter 4. Monday through Wednesday, The Drip. Monday, June 17, 1935. Frank Castellano returned to Philadelphia early Monday morning, planning to come back to New York later that week to finalize the real estate deal that had brought him to the city in the first place. He spent Monday handling normal business, meeting with his property managers in Philadelphia, reviewing rent collections, making calls about potential property acquisitions. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest that 400 miles north, his New York operations were beginning to experience problems. The first issue appeared Tuesday morning. The property manager for Castellano's Bronx buildings called to report that coal delivery for one building had been delayed. The supplier was experiencing scheduling difficulties, said they'd deliver later that week instead of Tuesday as planned. Minor inconvenience, not worth worrying about. Tuesday afternoon brought another call. The plumber scheduled to fix a broken pipe in one of the tenement buildings had postponed the repair. Something about parts availability. Would reschedule for later in the week. Again, annoying but not alarming. These things happen in property management. Tuesday evening, the manager of one of Castellano's midtown restaurants called to complain that the linen service had delivered tablecloths with stains that hadn't been properly cleaned, that several customers had commented on the poor quality, that this was unacceptable for an establishment trying to maintain standards. Castellano made a note to speak with the linen company, but didn't see it as urgent. Wednesday morning escalated the pattern. The trash collection at two of Castellano's Bronx buildings hadn't occurred on schedule. Garbage was piling up in the alleys. Tenants were complaining. The collection company claimed a truck breakdown, promised to catch up later that week, but offered no specific commitment. Wednesday afternoon, the bank holding mortgages on Castellano's properties sent a letter requesting a meeting to review his accounts. Routine review, the letter said. Nothing concerning, just standard procedure for ensuring borrowers maintained properties according to bank standards. Castellano found this odd because he'd never been asked for such a review before, but he scheduled the meeting for the following week. Wednesday evening brought more restaurant problems. A liquor delivery arrived late and incomplete. 2 cases of wine missing, 3 cases of beer the restaurant hadn't ordered. The distributor apologized, blamed warehouse confusion, said they'd correct it next delivery. Meanwhile, the restaurant had to scramble to cover the shortage during dinner service. By Wednesday night, Castellano was irritated. Too many small problems appearing simultaneously felt less like normal business friction and more like someone wasn't doing their job properly. He made mental notes to have serious conversations with his suppliers and service providers about professional standards and reliable performance. What Castellano didn't know was that each individual problem was minor enough that the businesses causing them could claim plausible excuses. Truck breakdowns, scheduling conflicts, warehouse errors, parts delays. Nothing provably intentional. Nothing that would indicate coordination. Just normal business inefficiencies that happen occasionally in any operation. But when you combine them, coal delayed at one building, plumbing delayed at another, trash piling up at 2 buildings, bank reviews being scheduled, restaurant supplies arriving wrong, the cumulative effect was stress. Stress on Castellano's property managers trying to keep tenants happy. Stress on his restaurant managers dealing with customer complaints. Stress on his own time as he fielded calls about problems that previously resolved themselves without requiring his personal attention. And the problems were about to accelerate because Wednesday night, 2 of Castellano's Bronx tenants, both connected to Harlem through family members who'd heard about the Red Rooster incident, decided to stop paying rent until building conditions improved. They'd been tolerating issues for months: peeling paint, drafty windows, unreliable heat, slow repairs. Now, with coal deliveries delayed and trash piling up and maintenance getting worse instead of better, they had justification to withhold payment and demand improvements. Thursday morning, Castellano's property manager called to report the rent strike. 2 tenants refusing to pay wasn't catastrophic. Castellano could start eviction proceedings, could pressure them legally. But it was unusual. And, combined with everything else going wrong, it felt like his operations were experiencing coordinated difficulties. Which they were, but Castellano still had no framework for understanding why. Chapter 5. Thursday and Friday. The Realization. Thursday, June 20th, 1935, started badly and got worse. The bank review meeting got moved up from the following week to Thursday afternoon. Urgent matter, the letter said, needed to discuss property conditions immediately. Castellano caught a morning train from Philadelphia to New York, annoyed at the disruption to his schedule. The meeting at the bank lasted 40 minutes. The loan officer, a man named Harrison, who'd always been friendly and accommodating in previous interactions, was formal and concerned this time. The bank had received reports. He didn't specify from whom. That Castellano's Bronx properties might not be maintained according to the standards expected of bank borrowers. The bank had sent an inspector to visit the buildings Tuesday. The inspector found trash accumulating in alleys, tenants complaining about delayed repairs and inconsistent heating, overall conditions that suggested possible deterioration in property management. Castellano tried to explain that these were temporary problems, normal business issues being addressed, nothing systematic or concerning. But Harrison was unmoved. The bank needed assurance that properties backing its loans were being properly maintained. The bank wanted Castellano to address the reported issues within 30 days and allow another inspection to verify improvements. If conditions didn't improve, the bank would consider calling the loan or demanding additional collateral. Castellano left the meeting furious. The bank was overreacting to minor temporary problems. This felt personal, though he couldn't understand why. Thursday afternoon brought more problems. One of his restaurants received a visit from a health inspector who found minor violations: slightly warm refrigerator temperature, small crack in a floor tile, expired permit that should have been renewed. Nothing major, but enough to require corrections within 2 weeks or face fines. Again, Castellano found the timing suspicious. His restaurants had never been inspected this frequently before. Thursday evening, Castellano was in his Midtown hotel room, making calls to his property managers and restaurant managers, trying to understand why everything was falling apart simultaneously, when he received an unexpected visitor. His name was Morris Klein, and he was a bookkeeper for some businesses in Harlem. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Castellano was experiencing operational difficulties and thought they should have a conversation. Castellano, desperate for information about what was happening, agreed to meet him in the hotel bar. Klein was direct. He explained that Castellano had offended some people in Harlem the previous Friday, that the offense had been taken seriously by people who controlled various business relationships throughout New York, and that the difficulties Castellano was experiencing weren't coincidences. They were responses to that offense. Klein didn't name Stephanie St. Clair or Bumpy Johnson. He didn't provide specifics about who was coordinating the problems. He simply made clear that Castellano's Harlem insult had triggered consequences rippling through his entire business operation. Castellano's first reaction was disbelief. He'd said some things in a nightclub. So what? How could anything he said in Harlem possibly affect his Bronx properties, his Midtown restaurants, his bank relationships? Klein explained patiently, because the people Castellano had insulted controlled networks that extended far beyond Harlem's geographic boundaries, networks of suppliers and service providers, and business relationships that overlapped with Castellano's own operations, networks that could make Castellano's business life difficult in ways that were individually minor but cumulatively devastating. Castellano asked what he needed to do to make it stop. Klein said he didn't know if it could stop. The offense had been public. The insult had been delivered into a microphone in front of hundreds of witnesses. The disrespect had been profound. But perhaps, if Castellano demonstrated genuine understanding of his error, if he made meaningful amends to the community he'd insulted, if he showed through actions rather than words that he recognized Harlem wasn't a place where white men could say whatever they wanted without consequences, perhaps the pressure might. Castellano asked what kind of amends Klein was suggesting. Klein mentioned that the Red Rooster Club had been trying to upgrade its sound system, that the band Castellano had insulted could use new instruments, that the Harlem community had various needs where someone with Castellano's resources could make a difference. Not a bribe, Klein was clear about that, but a demonstration that Castellano understood his words had caused harm, and that he wanted to repair that harm through substantive contribution. The conversation ended with Klein giving Castellano a way to contact him if Castellano decided to take the suggestion seriously. Then Klein left, leaving Castellano sitting in the hotel bar, trying to process the idea that a Friday night insult was costing him his business stability. Friday morning, June 21st, brought the final escalation. The coal supplier informed Castellano's property manager that all deliveries to Castellano's buildings were suspended until further notice. The supplier was experiencing capacity problems, couldn't commit to reliable service for Castellano's properties, suggested Castellano find alternative suppliers. The plumbing contractor sent a similar message, too busy with other commitments, couldn't prioritize Castellano's repairs right now, recommended finding someone else. The trash collection company indicated they'd be discontinuing service to Castellano's buildings at the end of the month. Operational restructuring, new routes, Castellano's properties no longer fit their service area. All three cancellations arrived Friday morning within 2 hours of each other, and suddenly Castellano understood, with absolute clarity, that what was happening wasn't bad luck or coincidence. It was orchestrated. It was systematic, and it was destroying his ability to operate his properties profitably. His Bronx buildings couldn't function without coal for heating, without plumbing repairs, without trash collection. Finding new suppliers would take weeks, would cost more money, would still face the same problem if the same network that canceled his current suppliers could pressure his new ones. His restaurants couldn't maintain quality without reliable linen service and liquor delivery. His bank was threatening to call his loans if property conditions didn't improve. But property conditions couldn't improve if he couldn't get basic services. The entire architecture of his business operation, the invisible infrastructure of suppliers and services and relationships that made everything work, was being systematically dismantled. And he'd caused it by grabbing a microphone 7 days earlier and saying words he thought carried no cost, because he was saying them about people he thought had no power. Friday afternoon, Castellano called the number Morris Klein had given him and said he wanted to discuss making amends. Klein said he'd arrange a meeting. That meeting happened Friday evening at a restaurant in Harlem, a sit-down dinner where Castellano, Klein, Sweet Jimmy Patterson from the Red Rooster, and several other Harlem business figures discussed what meaningful amends looked like. Castellano agreed to contribute $5,000 to the Red Rooster for sound system upgrades and band equipment. Not as payment, Klein emphasized, but as acknowledgement that Castellano's words had caused harm he wanted to repair. He agreed to pay for newspaper advertisements in Harlem's papers, apologizing for his offensive language and expressing respect for Harlem's community and businesses. He agreed to ensure that his future business dealings in New York would demonstrate the same respect for black business partners and customers that he'd show anyone else. In exchange, Klein indicated that the pressure on Castellano's operations would likely ease over the following weeks, that suppliers might become available again, that service providers might reconsider their capacity constraints, that Castellano might find New York's business environment becoming manageable again. The Friday night meeting ended with Castellano writing a check for $5,000, signing agreements to place the newspaper advertisements, and understanding, finally, what he should have understood before grabbing that microphone. That Harlem in 1935 wasn't a place where white men could dispense insults freely. That black business owners had built networks powerful enough to enforce respect, and that the cost of disrespect could be measured in canceled contracts, withdrawn services, and collapsing operations. Chapter 6. The following weeks. The coal deliveries resumed Monday, June 24th. The plumbing contractor called Tuesday to schedule the delayed repairs. The trash collection company discovered they could restructure routes to accommodate Castellano's buildings. After all, the bank review concluded satisfactorily once Castellano demonstrated he was addressing property conditions. The restaurant supply problems gradually normalized. By early July 1935, Castellano's operations had stabilized. The immediate crisis had passed. But several things had changed permanently. First, Castellano's profit margins had shrunk. The $5,000 payment to the Red Rooster was substantial, roughly equivalent to 3 months of net income from his Bronx properties. The costs of finding temporary alternative suppliers during the crisis, the lost revenue from restaurant disruptions, the legal fees from addressing the rent strike and bank review, the advertising costs combined. These expenses cut deeply into his bottom line for the year. Second, Castellano's reputation among New York's business community had shifted. Word spread about what had happened, not through newspapers or public announcements, but through the informal networks where business people discuss who's reliable and who's risky. Castellano became known as someone who'd made enemies in Harlem and had to pay significant costs to resolve the conflict. That reputation made other business people cautious about partnering with him, wary about getting caught in similar conflicts if they associated too closely with someone who'd proven he couldn't navigate New York's racial and neighborhood dynamics intelligently. Third, Castellano himself had learned something he couldn't unlearn. That the power structures he'd assumed were simple turned out to be complex. That the people he'd dismissed as irrelevant turned out to control relationships essential to his own operations. And that respect, genuine respect, not just surface politeness, was a business necessity in a city where black and white economic networks overlapped in ways he'd never bothered to understand. The Red Rooster Club used Castellano's $5,000 contribution to upgrade its sound system and purchase new instruments for the house band. Sweet Jimmy Patterson made sure every performer who played the club knew the story, knew what happened when someone disrespected the club and the neighborhood, knew that insults carried consequences, knew that Harlem's business community could fight back effectively when necessary. The story circulated through Harlem's clubs, restaurants, churches, and barbershops throughout the summer of 1935. It became a teaching example. This is what happens when white businessmen think they can say anything they want in our neighborhood. This is how we respond, not with violence that brings police crackdowns, but with economic pressure that hurts them where it matters. This is proof that our networks have power, that our relationships extend beyond Harlem, that disrespect is expensive. Stephanie St. Clair never publicly acknowledged her role in coordinating the pressure on Castellano. When asked years later about the incident, she'd simply say that business relationships in New York were complicated and that people who didn't understand those complications sometimes learned expensive lessons. Bumpy Johnson, similarly, never discussed his involvement beyond confirming that he'd helped gather information about Castellano's business interests. But everyone involved understood what had happened and why it mattered. The Red Rooster incident demonstrated that Harlem's business networks, the numbers operations, the protection arrangements, the supplier relationships, the mutual aid societies, the informal economic structures that made black business possible in a hostile city had matured into something powerful enough to affect business operations across borough boundaries. The networks could reach into the Bronx, into Midtown, into the banking system, into the restaurant industry, and create consequences for people who assumed Harlem had no leverage beyond its borders. Chapter 7. What changed? The Castellano incident didn't transform New York overnight. Racism didn't disappear. White business owners didn't suddenly develop enlightened attitudes about racial equality. But something did shift in how certain smart business people approached their interactions with Harlem and its residents. Before June 1935, many white businessmen visiting Harlem operated on the assumption that they were bringing commerce to a neighborhood that needed their money and should tolerate their attitudes regardless of how offensive those attitudes might be. The implicit logic was, we're the customers. We're spending money in your establishments, so you'll accept whatever behavior and language we choose to display because you need our dollars. After the Castellano incident became known within New York's business community, that assumption became riskier because now there was a concrete example of how that attitude could backfire. How insulting Harlem's community could trigger consequences that damaged business operations far beyond Harlem's boundaries. How the networks that made Harlem's economy function extended into supply chains and service providers that white business owners depended on. How the cost of casual racism could be measured in canceled contracts and withdrawn services and financial losses that exceeded whatever pride someone got from delivering racial insults. This didn't mean racism ended. It meant racism became more expensive and therefore more carefully calculated. Business owners who might have casually used slurs in Harlem clubs started reconsidering whether that casual language was worth potential retaliation. Property owners who might have openly discriminated against black tenants or customers started wondering whether their suppliers and service providers might have relationships with Harlem networks that could make their lives difficult. The calculation changed from, can I get away with this, to, what might this cost me if the people I'm insulting turn out to have more power than I assumed? For Harlem's business community, the Castellano incident became a proof of concept, evidence that the networks they built for mutual protection and economic survival could be deployed offensively as well as defensively, that they weren't limited to defending their own territory, but could reach out and affect operations in other boroughs and sectors, that they had leverage beyond what their formal economic resources might suggest. This understanding influenced how Harlem's business leaders approached relationships with white business partners, suppliers, and customers in subsequent years. They understood they weren't negotiating from weakness. They had networks, relationships, and capabilities that could make life difficult for people who disrespected them. That knowledge shaped negotiations, business terms, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior in ways that gradually, incrementally improved how Black business owners were treated by white business partners who understood the risks of disrespect.